untrained subjects doing leg extensions, 30% 1RM versus 80% 1RM, and there was no differences in hypertrophy. He posted this on social media, on Facebook at the time, and I, in my infinite wisdom, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, which I'm somewhat wiser now, I would not have made the same comment, but I said, come on, Stu. I said, these are untrained subjects doing just leg extensions. I said, that's basically, they'll grow from doing cardio. I said, if you really want to put it to the test, do this on a resistance trained population with a more ecologically valid program, you're going to see it's not going to be enough of a stimulus. So I did that study 6 months later, and no differences. So I eat humble pie every time I see Stu now. So the take home here is that you can gain appreciable hypertrophy across a very wide spectrum of loading ranges. Even 1 to 3 reps, the problem when you're getting into the really low, heavy loads is that you need to do more sets to make up, generally to get greater what we think is time under tension benefits. But just from an equalized set perspective, 6 to 30 plus reps on a whole muscle basis, you're going to see very similar hypertrophy. When you start getting above that, I collaborated on a study with the Brazilians where we looked at 20% 1RM, which came out to like 70 plus reps. And that actually showed a diminution, a reduction in hypertrophy from the other 40, 60, and 80%. And I think, again, we don't know, but I think people just get bored at that point. And they don't. And by the way, this is with the qualification that the sets need to be taken close to failure. So I think when you're dealing with these 70 rep sets, people are just like, I gotta stop, I'm just bored. So anywhere, certainly up to 30, 35, even 40 repetitions, provided those sets are being taken close to failure. No real differences in whole muscle hypertrophy. The jury is still out whether there may be fiber type specific benefits. Our lab carried out a study which seemed to suggest not. But I think there's some blood flow restriction training studies which do show at least some evidence of type 1 fiber specific hypertrophy. So I can't rule that out. We've had a few studies that I've been in have shown that training across a spectrum of loading ranges, having some heavier loads with some lighter loads may be synergistic. I do think that training within that 6 to 12 repetition range is an efficient approach. There's nothing wrong with that. So I think a general default would be that most of your training or much of it can and should be, unless there's a reason why not, maybe an injury. If you're rehabbing from an injury, the lighter loads can be very effective. But let's say 60, 70% of your training in the moderate rep range, and then having some heavier and some lighter loads sprinkled in may optimize hypertrophy. And look, for the vast majority of people, you wouldn't even worry about it. That would be a very minor difference. If there is a fiber type difference, maybe it can make a 5% difference in your total hypertrophic gains across a lifetime. I'm just throwing out that number, but that would be a guesstimate. It's not like it's going to be the difference between this and this. Volume seems to be a very controversial topic. Everyone seems to have a lot of opinions on this. So, first thing I'll say is that you can make really appreciable gains in hypertrophy with very low volume programs. We just completed a study. It's in review now. It's in preprint. There's a free preprint you can read. 2 days a week, 30-minute sessions, so it was 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week. Had very nice gains, 2 to 9% across the biceps, triceps, and quads, so depending on the site that we were looking at. So that's quite appreciable. But there is evidence certainly of a dose response. Trying to get an exact number is an exercise in futility. Pardon the pun. We can somewhat guesstimate, and it has been guesstimated, somewhere between 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week is kind of a generalized guideline for how many sets you should do per muscle. Some people seem to respond quite well to lower volume routines, probably as good as somewhat higher, and some people seem to need more volume to make better gains. You do not necessarily, here's a few things. The studies that have been done generally on localized muscles. So we don't have studies that have done like 20 sets for chest and back and triceps and biceps and quads and glutes in the same program. So the studies that we have, they might have just looked at the quads or just looked at the biceps, triceps, and quads. So again, very limited extrapolations can be made to whole training programs, whole body training programs from this. What I would say is that if you're going to create a routine, I'd probably err on the side of the lower end to start with. There is some evidence that perhaps periodizing short periods of higher volume approaches might be a way to quote unquote shock the body, so you can periodize volume over time. And I think where the volume recommendations can come in handy is with specialization. So this is just a personal, again, from personal expertise. I think one way we can interpret the data is that somewhat higher volumes, and perhaps up to 30 sets or perhaps even somewhat more, can be potentially beneficial for hypertrophy short term for a given muscle group. So if you think about the overall number of sets that you're going to do for all your body parts in a given week, so let's say that's 100 sets for biceps, triceps, chest, back, shoulders, quads, glutes. Let's say that's 100 sets. Let's say you want to devote 30 sets of that to your back because that's a lagging muscle group. You then have 70 sets to apportion for the rest of your body. Overtraining will not be specific to a given muscle. It is specific to the total, systemically, to the total body. So if you're maintaining a total volume for all the exercise you're doing, conceivably, again, this has not been tested empirically. So I might be here in 5 years if they would have me back and give you a different opinion if we get more research. So we can only go by the research we have and try to draw opinions from that. We do enough time. All right, frequency, another interesting topic. There's the bro science crowd who, they do chest on Monday because Monday is National Chest Day. Back on Tuesday, legs on Wednesday, shoulders on Thursday, and of course arms on Friday because you have to go out to the bar with a pump on Friday night. And then you have the alternative. So are you guys familiar with the Norwegian Frequency Project? Raise your hands. So you're the one. So yeah, the Norwegian, our colleagues over in Norway, I had the pleasure of lecturing with them some years ago, and they carried out a study circa 2010, so like 15 years ago now, and it was on their Norwegian powerlifting team, and of course the Norwegians have one of the top powerlifting teams in the world. I don't know if they're better than the Danes, but the cool thing is that the Norwegian School of Sports Science, they have access to the team. They basically train, I think, the powerlifting team. Anyway, they did a study where they had the groups of powerlifters. It was a small study, I think 12 subjects. But half of the group did training 3 days a week with 4 sets per exercise. And this was just deadlift. This was the basic, as I recall, deadlift, squat, and bench. And the other group did the same volume, so 2 sets, but 6 days a week. So basically just spreading out the volume over 6 days. And people went crazy because the study showed that the people who were the powerlifters training 3 days a week got no gains. And that the group that spread it out over 6 days got 5 to 10% increases in their quad size. And there was after that some online trainers, were coming up with these training programs for 6-day-a-week frequency. And, well, long story short, we've carried out studies, our group has as well as others that have tried to replicate that and has not shown the same thing. And interesting thing is that they never published the study. It was presented at the 2012 Sports Congress, but they never published the study. When I was there, I said, well, tell me, this is really interesting results, why haven't you published it? And they said, we don't want everyone to know the secrets of the Norwegian powerlifting team. I kind of scratched my head and I was like, if you don't want anyone to know, why does everyone know about it? Why is it all over the internet? And why did you present it at the, anyway, I didn't get an answer to that. But what they did tell me, interestingly, was that for the hypertrophy program, they do not use that. They train them 3 days a week and they do higher volume. So Bottom line is that the meta-analytic data seem to show that it really doesn't matter with lower to moderate volumes up to around 10 to 12 sets per muscle in a session. 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. And by the way, this isn't frequent. I'm talking about frequency per muscle group. So you probably, to get sufficient overall volume in, will need a minimum of 3 days a week of training. But this is training per set per muscle. How many sets per muscle per week? And again, if it's moderate to lower volumes, 1, 2, 3, splitting it up doesn't seem to make much difference. So you can make similar gains. You can spread out your volume how you want. When you start getting into higher volume routines, let's say you're doing your Monday chest routine, and instead of your usual 10 sets, you now want to bump up that volume, you're going to do 20 sets. You're better off probably doing at least 2 days of 10 sets rather than 1 day of 20 sets. It could, we don't know why, it could be because of diminishing returns, it could be because of the protein synthetic response might have a curve that taps out as to how much protein synthesis you can get in a given session from a given amount of volume, we don't know. So spreading out the volume can be more advantageous if you're doing more higher volume approaches. Rest periods, another topic that I've somewhat changed my opinion on. In the NSCA text, it always talked about short rest periods for hypertrophy. It was based on the hormone hypothesis that if you do shorter rest intervals, you're going to jack up the testosterone, GH, and IGF-1 levels for about an hour after your session. There's a correlation between the acute hormonal response. Most of the research that's been conducted over the last dozen or so years seems to show that that isn't involved to any real extent in the hypertrophic process. So we can discount that. And some of the research from our lab and others have shown that not only do you not get better results with shorter rest periods, but it actually might have diminished effects. It might actually blunt it. We actually just carried out a meta-analysis. This was after this paper had been published. And we seemed to show around 90 seconds. Once you get around 90 seconds, there's not much benefit to resting longer. But at 60 seconds, there was reductions in hypertrophy versus 90 seconds. It's always hard when you have these blunt cutoffs. So I always want to talk cautiously. It's not like you rest 61 seconds and you're okay, 60 seconds. So these things are always on a continuum. And again, there's not been a lot of studies on this. I think we had 9 studies that met inclusion criteria, and ours was the only one that used resistance trained subjects. So trying to draw inferences to trained populations can be somewhat difficult. But I would say more nuanced perspective, the somewhat longer rests, so 2 to 3 minutes maybe for your compound multi-joint movements, because you're going to be more fatigued. You need more interset recovery to get back your energy resources to recover your fatigue levels. Whereas your single joint, and perhaps some of the machine-based movements, 60 to 90 seconds might be more appropriate. But I think what it comes down to, and certainly my general approach, when you become more experienced at resistance training, you can auto-regulate. I don't sit there with a watch and say, all right, my 90 seconds is up, I can hit my set. If you're a newbie coming in, if you're personal training for a newbie, yeah, maybe you want to regulate that because they don't have a good feel for when they're ready to go back. But I would just say for the majority of people who've been training, and you guys all look pretty jacked, so I'm assuming you were all trained, you could just say, you know what, I feel ready to do my next set, and go to it. And by the way, there is some evidence in research. We have a couple of research studies that have looked at the loss of repetitions over sets, and it was very similar between 2 minutes and an auto-regulated rest period in trained individuals. So that you're going to lose some repetitions at a given load, unless you're resting like 5 minutes, which isn't very practical. There's been research showing that you're going to get similar reductions in the number of reps. It's not that much. Exercise, so actually I could do and do a whole half-day lecture on this. But bottom line here is that if you're looking certainly from a bodybuilding perspective, and looking to have muscular symmetry, you need to work the muscle from many different angles. Now, certain sports, you might focus on a given muscle for hypertrophy, because other muscles don't matter as much or even at all. And that, of course, I can't talk to that because it's different for each sport. But let's say you are someone who just wants, either you're a bodybuilder or just someone who wants, quote unquote, your own ideal of perfect physique. You need to train from multiple angles. You need to take an applied anatomical approach, knowing, so for instance, working the upper chest, generally you're going to hit it more from the incline bench. Hopefully I'm not telling you anything you don't know here. And working because of the fiber type distribution, the sternal portion, the mid and lower portion, doing flat and decline even may tie in more of the fibers. So you need to ultimately understand applied anatomy and then work the muscles from different angles. You don't want to have too much variation. There's no such thing as muscle confusion per se. Like, muscles don't get confused, they don't have brains. So what we do find is that movement patterns, if you're not doing this, particularly relates to your more complex movements. If you're going to do squats, deadlifts, rows, these are exercises that require a lot of coordination. And if you do them once, let's say if I squatted today and didn't squat again for 4 months, I'm going to have a pretty crappy squat. So you want to have these complex movements in a regular rotation in your routine, generally on a weekly basis, at least every couple weeks. Whereas if you're doing a biceps curl, leg extension, certain machine movements, I mean, I could do a leg extension today and not do it again for a year and do a perfect leg extension, just from the muscle memory. So those you can then change more often, and there might be benefits in that respect to just getting a novelty response. So novelty, the body adapts through progressive overload, through novelty, through the body wanting to being challenged beyond its present state. So trying to get different movements, free weights, cables, machines, they're synergistic. The benefits of one are the disadvantages of the other. So combining them can give you, again, greater, how much difference? If you just did all free weight movements, you're going to get the majority of your gains. But again, if you want to optimize results, that's where these more intuitive approaches come into play. And one last thing, so again, beyond I could talk for hours on this topic, and it's a pet topic of mine, but you also want to think of the type of muscle you're working. So on biarticular muscles, rectus femoris, the hamstrings, the gastrocnemius, you want to try to place them in a greater degree of stretch. So there's been actually some quite interesting recent papers on this, some of them I've been involved in, where leaning back, let's say, if you're doing leg extensions, having instead of a 90-degree seat, going back to a 40-degree lean where you're stretching the rec fem actually shows greater hypertrophy of the rec fem. In the hamstrings curl, doing a seated hamstring, where again the hamstring is placed in the hamstrings complex, is placed under greater stress, you're going to get greater stress. So there's passive stresses and active stresses, active tension, passive tension. So creating this greater passive tension enhances the effect. Doing straight leg calf raises works the gastroc. And again, I can go on. We don't unfortunately have time, but those are considerations that should be taken into account when you're choosing exercises. Set endpoint, we're talking about training to failure. Again, another topic where I've quite changed my opinion on. I came from the old school bodybuilding, hardcore approach of you either go all out or you go home. So I'd go into the gym, every set was to failure, then I'd have to do like some forced reps and drop sets and everything else you can imagine to just push my body into oblivion, to annihilate it. And the emerging evidence seems to show that you need to train close to failure, but being 2 reps or so away from failure produces very similar hypertrophic effects as going all out. And this has been in trained subjects. The bro in me still wants to believe that there may be a benefit of selectively taking some sets to failure, perhaps your last set. But if you're doing multiple set routines, as long as you're training kind of in that 1 to 3, and by the way, I have a study in collaboration with a group in Finland at vascular. I think we have some vascular. Shout out to Joa Homi, which is now in review. But we looked at doing one RIR, repetition in reserve, so one set, one rep away from failure versus 2 weeks at 4 RIR, then 2 weeks at 3, 2 weeks at 2, and then 2 weeks at 1, or something like this. 3 weeks. Forgot the exact. It's been a while since we did this. Anyway, no difference. So training at a spectrum of RIRs versus going all sets at a 1 RIR, and these were trained subjects. So again, I do think that perhaps selectively using failure may be a way to push your body to progressively overload it if you are a very advanced lifter. So if you are, let's say you're an aspiring bodybuilder and you've been training for 5 years, I do think that particularly on your single joint exercises, so using this more on exercises that are less fatiguing, where if you do, let's say, 3 sets of an exercise and you do a 2 RIR, 1 RIR, and then go to failure on the last set, we don't have any research on this, but I still want to cling to that belief that there may be some benefit. And look, there's a logical basis for it. So without knowing, I don't think there'll be, everything is cost benefit. So when I give recommendations like this, I said, well, what would be the downside of this recommendation? And I just don't see one. So if you take that last set to failure, could you maybe get a little extra gains from it? Maybe. Some advanced techniques. Most of the advanced techniques we have not seen to show better results. So things like supersets, drop sets. However, they do make training more efficient, so you can get more training done in less time. And they seem to show somewhat similar benefits, at least in the designs that we've had. Our group has carried out some recent research on this. So what I would say is that to get more time efficiency, you can use some of these strategies without really compromising your gains. One of the techniques that seems to maybe have some benefit is accentuated eccentric overload, where you use a supramaximal load and then lower the load under control, and then have a partner lift it up for you, or you can do like a 2 on, a 2 up, 1 down. So let's say you do a leg extension, you go both legs up and then lower it with 1 leg, so you're doing double the amount of weight. These are potential strategies that may, again, I think, like I said, research or evidence exists on a continuum. I still think that most of this is low to moderate level evidence, certainly not strong, but I think we have some evidence that there may be a benefit. And again, if you selectively use it, I don't think there's a downside to it. Concurrent training, another topic, as most of these are, where there's been a lot of change in opinions over the years. When that was coming up, it was taught that cardio would kill your gains if you did any appreciable cardio. And look, that would be really bad for a lot of your team sport athletes. We call it soccer, I know you guys call it football, but in America, football is throwing a pass, just so you guys know. But whether it's soccer, European football, or world football, or American football, basketball, hockey, they're combination sports where they require anaerobic, aerobic conditioning, and that would be really bad if you're going to lose all your gains. And the good news is that most of the more recent research does not seem to show much interference. Now, the caveat to that is most of these studies do not use very high volume training protocols, especially with the endurance portion. So I think this is where nuance comes in, and you have to take the research, you have to really look into the research. What I would say here is that doing moderate levels of cardiovascular exercise, let's say steady state, if you're walking, like I always think it's a good health goal to take 10,000 plus steps a day. That's not going to kill your gains. We certainly have zero evidence that it would. But if you're going out for 2-hour runs, and you're, especially if you're a more advanced resistance trainer, probably not a good idea. So again, it really comes down to how much are you going to do as to whether there's going to be a detrimental effect. And what I would say is, if you are going to do cardio, here's just some three very basic, quote-unquote, rules. Not a hard rule, but general guidelines to follow. Number one, if possible, do the cardio on separate days, because there does seem to be interference when they're in close proximity of one another, particularly from a resistance training and when you're doing the training on the same day. So if you can, spread them out over different days. But if you're training resistance training 4 days a week and you want to do cardio 5 days a week, you're not going to be able to do that. If you're doing it on the same day, if possible, morning, evening, do one morning session of one, evening session of the other. And if you can't do that, which most people or many people can't because of their schedules, always do your resistance training first before your cardio. You're not going to hurt your performance in cardio from doing your RT, generally speaking, unless you're doing like the Tom Platz workout for your legs. Those of you who grew up in bodybuilding will get that reference. And you would, or potentially could, harm your resistance training performance by doing your cardio first. And finally, periodization. So this is a very controversial topic, and I'm not going to speak broadly to the benefits or lack thereof in team sports and other contexts just specific to hypertrophy. We do not have good evidence that periodization is beneficial to hypertrophy. We don't have good evidence that it's not. We have there's very little study that has looked, in my humble opinion, at periodization from a hypertrophic standpoint in a ecologically valid way. Again, this is a topic that we don't have time to spend a lot of time on. But everyone's concept of how to carry out a periodized routine is going to be somewhat different in many people's world. There's not one way to periodize. There's many different ways to periodize. And so when you look at a research study and they're doing that over short periods of time, which you wouldn't see benefits of, with untrained subjects, where it's generally not a good idea. Bottom line is we're not going to be able to glean much from it. What I would say, to me, periodization is a structured form of planning. And I ascribe to the old Chinese adage that those who fail to plan to fail. So whether you call it periodization, whether you call it planning, you want to have a plan as to get how you're going to get from here. All right, I'm starting my training cycle here, and I'm going to end it here for whatever goal you're going to have. And then you're going to start a new cycle at that point. Let's say it's an 8-week, 10-week, 12-week training cycle. What's your goal during that period? How are you going to get from there? You should have some type of plan to make that happen. So I would hope we can all agree that planning is important, and there is no universal best plan. I, again, cannot give you the 10 Commandments. If you follow this particular way of planning, you're going to get your best gains, because it's been shown over and over with different bodybuilders. They have different ways of getting to the same place and are very effective with it. What I would probably say is there's likely a best plan for you as an individual and your individual goal and other factors. So you have to consider what time factors are limiting you. You know, what are your constraints there? What nutritionally, sleep-wise? These are all factors as to how you want to structure your routine, whether you're going to get more training days during the week, fewer training days, your volume might vary based on that, etc. And that is my talk. Thank you so much for coming.